July 24, 1944, 7:30 in the morning. White Beach 2 on the northwest coast of Tinian, and the strangest sound on the island was not gunfire. It was the shriek of agricultural steel. The noise came off the coral ledge in a bright metallic scream as amphibian tractors shoved forward under sheets of spray and smoke, their noses fitted with crude portable ramps built from sugar mill beams ripped out of Saipan. Salt water flew off the treads. Exhaust rolled low and blew over the reef. Men in wet dungarees leaned into the mechanism with their hands black from grease and rust, guiding steel meant for cane and commerce into the business of war. On Japanese maps, those coral shelves had been part of the island's armor. On that morning, they sounded like a farm being dragged, bolt by bolt, into the sea. Somewhere inland, on the island that housed the headquarters of the 1st Air Fleet, Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuda was already inside a day that no staff paper had prepared him for. Tinian was supposed to be difficult in the old way. Coral cliffs, narrow beaches, fixed defenses. Time enough to concentrate artillery on the obvious approaches and grind an attacker down where surf and reef did half the work. Instead, the first reports from the northwest did not describe a grand assault on Tinian town or a heavy thrust at the east coast. They described something almost insulting. American vehicles were climbing cliffs where vehicles were not supposed to climb. Tractors were mounting coral on movable steel. Marines were coming in over beaches so small that men on the island had treated them as a nuisance, not a battlefield. The world of tables, range cards, and logical estimates did not vanish in a single flash. It was humiliated first. Tinian had been prepared for a different story. Before the war closed in, it had been a plantation island in the northern Marianas, a checkerboard of cane fields and windbreaks, neat from the air, Japanese and Korean labor cutting and hauling under a tropical sky. When Tokyo finally understood what the Marianas meant, the island changed clothes without changing shape. Civilian order hardened into military purpose. Airfields began spreading across the Coral Plateau. By 1944, there were 3 military airfields on the island and a 4th under construction. The northern strip, Ushi Point, was still modest by American standards, but it was enough to matter. From the Marianas, the new American bomber could reach the Japanese home islands. That thought hung over every decision in the summer of 1944, like heat. The islands were not important because they were large. They were important because distance itself bent around them. Japanese defenders relied on the geometry the island seemed to offer. Much of Tinian was wrapped in coral cliffs. The practical landing grounds lay where common sense said they would lie, toward Tinian town in the southwest, or along the more accessible stretches of the eastern shore between Asiga and Masalog. Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata, the island commander, wrote his plans around that logic. Even American studies had looked at the tiny northwestern beaches and judged them hardly fit for more than spot landings of men. The beaches called White 1 and White 2 were cramped, broken by outcrops, pinched against ledges, miserable places to dream about putting ashore tractors and tanks. So mines were laid there, yes, but not with the fear reserved for a true invasion. The heavy gaze of defense stayed fixed on the south and east, where a proper enemy was supposed to arrive. The American answer to that old military logic did not begin with a speech. It began with welding. Commodore Paul James Halloran, the Seabee commander in the area, had the sort of problem that makes traditional soldiers glance at a map and say no. The Marines needed armor and vehicles to get over the coral steppe at the White Beaches. Halloran's men went to the Japanese sugar mill on Saipan, tore out steel members, and turned them into portable ramps that could be fitted onto amphibian tractors. 2 long steel beams, ugly and practical, enough to support medium tanks, enough to make geology negotiable. There was no romance in the thing when it was being assembled. Men sweated through their dungarees. Hammers struck with the dull ring of shop work. Weld seams spat bright points into dim corners. The beams smelled of old industry, scorched paint, and hot metal. Yet the invention carried an entire American habit inside it. If the island did not offer a road, the road would be brought to the island. Halloran belonged to that breed the United States Navy had created in the war almost by necessity. Builders who had to fight, fighters who had to build before the dust settled, engineers who thought in tonnage and grades and fuel lines while shells were still arriving. In the Pacific, this habit of mind kept appearing in places the Japanese had treated as temporary, primitive, or naturally secure. At Tarawa, Seabees landed with Marines and had a smashed airfield functioning within 15 hours. At Majuro and Kwajalein, atolls that from a distance seemed too slight for the ambitions of empires became anchorages and aviation sites. Tinian was a greater prize because it was flat enough, wide enough, and close enough to Japan to hold a new kind of air war. Halloran could stand on that coral island and see not merely a captured airstrip but a northern plain that could be cut, filled, leveled, rolled, paved, fueled, and measured into one of the largest airfields on Earth. Measured. That was the first American act after assault and survival. Measuring. A white-painted grade stake, driven into coral with a strip of cloth tied near its top, appeared almost too delicate to matter, yet men carried them by the armful. Surveyors planted them in lines across cane fields, across shell holes, across scraped earth and coral dust. A rifleman thinks in range. A gun captain thinks in azimuth. A man building an airbase thinks in inches of elevation, in where water will sit after rain, in how much cut must come off one rise to fill the sag beyond it. On Tinian, those thin white stakes began to march northward after the Marines, and every one of them announced the same blunt intention. This island will be graded. The landing that morning did not feel like a blueprint. It felt cramped, violent, wet, and improvised. Naval bombardment had been battering Tinian for days. Smoke drifted over cane and broken masonry. The sea at the white beaches foamed white against the rock. When the first assault waves came in, the ladders of noise never stopped. The concussion of ship guns offshore, the hammering of machine guns in short bursts from hidden positions, the clank and slide of those steel doodlebug ramps, the slap of water under hulls, the shouted corrections of coxswains trying to keep line and timing. Marines hit the narrow sand and did not pause to admire the ingenuity that had put them there. They ran under packs, rifles, grenades, radios, Bangalore torpedoes, flamethrowers, all the private weight each man had to carry before the larger weights of artillery and armor could come up. At the ledges, Halloran's contraption did exactly what the Japanese assumption had declared impossible. Amphibian tractors nosed up, their metal ramps braced against coral, and vehicles followed. Steel grated, treads bit, engines roared harder as drivers felt for purchase. Every machine climbing that ledge was a kind of argument. If it slipped, men had to shove, guide, curse, and try again. If it made the top, the beachhead changed character immediately. Because a coral shelf that had promised delay had just been turned into an access point. That was how American industrial war often announced itself in the Pacific. Not with elegance, with a machine that looked temporary, noisy, and slightly absurd until the instant it worked. By midday, the impossible had become traffic. White 1 and White 2 were still tiny. They were still exposed. But men, weapons, radios, and supplies were flowing over ground that should have denied them. The Japanese defenders had not been absent. Fire came in from positions inland and along the flanks. Men were hit getting off craft, hit crossing the sand, hit under the ledge and above it. But the weight of the American assault kept thickening. The problem with a beach judged too small for invasion is that once the attacker proves otherwise, the defender has not merely been outflanked, he has been made late. Reserves are still looking toward the wrong coastline. Guns are still laid for the wrong arcs. Doctrine is still facing the wrong sea. Kakuda's island began collapsing in sections. He had authority on paper, prestige in uniform, and an island full of men who were supposed to make the Americans bleed around the obvious objectives. Yet even before the northern lodgment had fully widened, the logic beneath his position had started to crack. Tinian's 4 modest Japanese runways, its garrison of more than 9,000 Army and Navy personnel, its cane fields, ammunition dumps, construction units, and prepared positions all existed on the assumption that geography would force the enemy to act in familiar ways. But American war in the Central Pacific was getting stranger by the month. If an atoll could become a base, if a cliff could become a ramp, if a reef could become a logistics lane, then old confidence in natural obstacles began to look sentimental. The island itself invited conversion. Tinian was nearly flat over much of its area, coral under thin soil, with cane land that could be stripped and surveyed. From the air it looked ordered, even domestic, the famous chessboard of fields and windbreaks. For Halloran and the men who worked under him, that orderliness was almost a temptation. The northern end could hold runways aligned east to west. Roads could be cut in a grid. Hardstands could be laid out in disciplined rows. Storage areas, fuel farms, camps, repair shops, revetments, dumps, hospitals, and mess halls could spread with the same confidence that Kane once had. The island was only about the size of Manhattan, and, soon enough, Seabees would give its roads names like Broadway and 8th Avenue, as if they were not merely building a base, but transplanting an urban certainty into coral. George W. Larson came into that certainty late enough to miss the landing, and early enough to help write the airfield into the ground with his own hands. He had been in an arms plant in Iowa, then in uniform, then at Farragut, then across the Pacific in the heat of a transport sold so hot and damp that he spent as much time on deck as he could, chasing wind. By the time he landed on Tinian on October 24, 1944, the island had already passed from battle into work, which is to say from one kind of exhaustion into another. He went over the side on cargo nets into bobbing landing craft, reached shore with a carbine and full gear, and found a captured island that still did not resemble anything like safety. Everything had to be unloaded from transports offshore, shifted into landing craft, hauled to beaches, loaded again into trucks, and dragged inland. Men worked 18 hours a day moving the weight that makes air war possible long before the airplanes arrive. His first camp sat in a muddy sugarcane field. That detail alone explains more of the Pacific War than any number of elegant arrows on maps. Men did not step off ships into finished bases. They stepped into mud. They slept in small tents. They scraped filth off themselves with helmets after work. Rain turned the island sticky and obscene. Trucks bogged to their axles. Sometimes even bulldozers had to be pulled out by other bulldozers. Hot coffee and field rations tasted better than they had any right to, because they were being swallowed in a place where every dry object was precious and every clean object temporary. Stray Japanese soldiers still came out at dusk looking for food. Work parties wore helmets and carried carbines. Security patrols moved around camp at night. Men building the largest airfield in the world to be still had slit trenches nearby and rifles at hand. Larson's battalion, the 135th Naval Construction Battalion, was given 2 of the giant runways at North Field. The existing Japanese strip at Ushi Point had been taken almost at once and worked on immediately, even before the fighting ended. But Halloran's plan for the north end was far larger than a repaired captured airfield. The site swallowed men and machines by the thousand. Power shovels, rooters, rollers, drills, well rigs, graders, bulldozers, trucks, water wagons, asphalt plants. Equipment worked 20 hours a day. Maintenance crews inherited the remaining 4 hours in bloody-handed fragments of sleep, tools, and coffee. Coral was harder on machinery than enemy fire on some days. It chewed tires, battered truck beds, dulled blades, and got into everything. Men welded quarter-inch steel plates onto dump truck floors to keep them from being eaten alive. Runway mat sections were welded to truck bed sides to increase capacity. Steel cable was strung between dual axles so broken chunks of coral would not wedge between the wheels and wreck them. A white grade stake appeared in Larson's world the way a bayonet appears in another man's, as a fact of the trade. Surveyors drove them in where cuts had to be made, where fills had to stop, where a road line curved, where a runway edge must hold. Larson would come onto a section in his road grader and read the ground by those stakes. He drove finishing passes over crushed coral, lowering and lifting the blade by feel, by instruction, by the eye trained on a faint white marker 6 truck lengths ahead. When a larger piece of coral showed itself stubborn and whole where no whole piece was wanted, he stopped the machine, climbed down with pick and shovel, pried the thing loose, rolled it away, filled the wound with smaller crushed coral, tamped it, and climbed back up into the grader. That was how a bomber base was made. Not only by grand totals, though the totals were monstrous, by a man getting down from a machine to remove one stone the size of a bucket because it was not supposed to be there. The coral pits were worlds of their own. To create the runways, taxiways, hardstands, campsites, roads, and revetments Halloran wanted, the Seabees had to dig and move staggering quantities of earth and coral. Trucks ran designated one-way roads, loaded in one direction and empty in the other, a ceaseless white circulation of dust. Loaders bit into coral banks, drills rattled. In at least one case, a marine tank was used to fire armor-piercing shells into a hill so charges could be set in the shattered face. Then came the dump trucks, hundreds of them, hauling coral that flashed white in the tropical sun until the whole northern part of Tinian looked as if some inland sea had dried and left its bed exposed. Men wore goggles, men tied cloth over their mouths, men coughed up fine white dust and blew it out blackened from their nostrils. Water wagons came through to lay salt water onto prepared surfaces because salt and rolling would help bind the crushed coral almost as hard as concrete. Traditional warfare would have recognized the seizure of an island, the reduction of bunkers, the destruction of a garrison. It would have understood capture. What it struggled to understand was transformation at this speed. After the Battle of Tinian ended, and Colonel Ogata's defense had been smashed, after Kakuta's authority had dissolved into flight and concealment, the American task did not relax. It accelerated. The north end of the island became a construction front. White-grade stakes advanced. Cane disappeared. High spots were cut down. Low spots were filled. Rollers with heavy teeth chewed over the surface layer by layer. Trucks packed the fill by merely passing over it in endless succession. Fuel farms were laid out inland from submerged pipelines. Road surfaces spread. Quonset huts rose. Bomb dumps were revetted. Shops were built. The strange and brutal elegance of the process lay in its refusal to wait for peace. The base was built while the island still smelled of battle. Larson could feel the airfield entering existence under his hands. He worked 10-hour shifts with the overlap for servicing and feeding. At night, portable electric lights threw hard white circles over black machinery and white dust. Coral reflected light oddly, so every moving blade seemed to cut moonlight. When Japanese aircraft approached, the lights were killed and men dropped into slit trenches. Once, Larson heard a Japanese Betty bomber come in low enough that he abandoned his grader and dove for cover. He listened to bullets smack into the machine he had just left. Snipers fired from concealment, hiding muzzle flashes with bamboo or cane. Marines swept them when they could. Rain hammered down and turned the roads to paste. Fungus threatened men's feet. Larson sprayed medication into his shoes. Water had to be drunk constantly. Sun burned through shirts. Regulations loosened until men cut utility trousers into shorts and worked shirtless in the heat, skin turning the color of dust and rust. Across the island, the larger mathematical miracle kept building. Halloran's 6th Naval Construction Brigade, with battalions spread across Tinian's tasks, drove the effort toward a scale the Pacific had not yet seen. Enough coral and earth were moved to dwarf any sensible human image. Runways at North Field and West Field stretched to lengths once considered extravagant, each one broad enough to look less like an airstrip than a pale man-made river laid over the island. Taxiways spread in a network so extensive that the field seemed to occupy the horizon. Hardstands multiplied until a visitor could stand in one place and count a geometry of parked bombers that looked almost industrial rather than martial. Tinian, a coral island less than 40 square miles in area, was being taught to behave like a continental interior. The Japanese had prepared airfields too, of course. They understood aviation. They understood the need for island strips. But on Tinian, their preparations had the scale of a garrison trying to support a war. The Americans arrived intending to use the island to support an industrial civilization at war. Those are not the same thing. One airstrip is a local asset. 6 giant runways, miles of taxiways, fuel farms measured in immense capacity, roads, hospitals, storage zones, shops, and camps for tens of thousands of men form an ecosystem. Once that ecosystem existed within bomber range of Japan, the campaign changed shape. The island was no longer a piece on the board. It was a machine shop pointed at the home islands. December 21, 1944, gave the machine its first unmistakable voice. The first B-29 landed at North Field, while construction still continued around it. Larson was operating a road grader on an adjacent runway when the news reached him not as news, but as commotion. Sirens blew. Jeeps and command cars burst toward the finished strip. Men and equipment were hustled clear. The bomber came in over coral that had been cane and broken ground weeks before. Its engines had a depth to them, unlike the rasp of construction equipment, not sharper but heavier, a pressure in the chest. For the men on the ground, the moment was not simply triumphant. It was disorienting. The machine they had been building for existed all at once, silver and immense, touching down on a field they had only known as grade lines, truck routes, rutted cuts, and dust. That airplane was more than proof of workmanship. It was the answer to the question hidden inside the title of Tinian itself. How had the United States turned coral into an air base? By refusing to separate invasion from engineering, engineering from logistics, logistics from maintenance, maintenance from volume, volume from repetition, repetition from morale, morale from food, fuel, spare parts, and sleep. The Japanese defenders had expected an island battle. They got an island battle, and attached to it they got a moving continent. When the bomber rolled out on North Field, the difference became visible. Not abstractly, physically. A machine weighing far more than anything the original Japanese strip had been designed to handle now trusted its life to crushed coral, grade stakes, rollers, water wagons, and men with shovels who had climbed down from graders in the night to fix small imperfections by hand. Then the airfield began to fill. More B-29s arrived. Construction equipment shifted aside for them without stopping the work. Taxiways had to be treated so engines would not suck in coral dust and burst into flame. Asphalt was laid. Hard stands filled with bombers and ground crews. North Field alone grew into the largest airfield in the world at the time, and with West Field the island held 6 great runways, miles upon miles of taxiways and service roads, room for hundreds of aircraft, and camps large enough to seem like a small city. By the end, Tinian could house tens of thousands of American personnel. The island that Japanese planning had treated as something defended by cliffs was now defended, if that is the word, by abundance. Abundance has its own sound. On Tinian it was the drone of generators through the dark, the clatter of mess gear, the backfire of trucks, the hiss of air hoses, the pop of welding sparks, the bark of graders reversing, the deep wash of bomber engines warming at dawn, and the wet slap of hoses laying water on coral. It was the luxury of spare parts, the presence of replacement tires, the appearance of asphalt, the existence of a washing machine in some unit area, better mattresses, ice cream, cold beer, a letter from home arriving in a mail sack on a dump truck, medication for fungus, fresh coffee, enough pipe and tankage to move fuel inland in huge quantities. The symbolic object of the island was still that white-grade stake, but by now it stood in a different world. Once it had marked bare intention in raw ground. Now it stood beside runways, so long and hard-packed that bombers launching from them could reach the Japanese home islands with reliability the China bases had never offered, and from Tinian they came, incendiary raids, mining missions, long-range bombing, the arithmetic of distance, which had protected Japan while the war rolled across the outer empire, began to fail. The men who had expected island battles in the old pattern now watched a coral island generate an air offensive of terrifying constancy. Bombers rose from North Field and West Field in organized streams. They hit the home islands by day at altitude and, later, by night at low level with fire. They mined sea lanes and harbors, Japanese shipping, already strained, bled under the pressure. The Empire had not merely lost ground. It had lost the ability to prevent raw geology from being converted into a launch platform for continuous assault. For the Japanese side, the paralysis was not only physical, though the physical part was awful enough. Fixed defenses destroyed, garrison dead, airfields captured and improved by the enemy, shipping threatened, homeland cities within reach. It was also intellectual. The assumptions had not been crazy. They had been normal. Beaches mattered. Coral cliffs mattered. Distance mattered. Construction took time. Remote islands imposed scarcity. Yet on Tinian, each of those beliefs was met by a very American correction. If beaches were too small, widen their usefulness with portable ramps. If cliffs blocked vehicles, climb them. If an island lacked material, quarry the island itself. If rain ruined the ground, crown it, drain it, roll it, bind it with salt water and asphalt. If trucks wore out, plate them, weld them, send them back. If a machine broke, fix it in the overlap. If a runway edge was wrong, put a man with a pick and shovel next to a road grader in the dark, and make it right before dawn. Kakuta himself did not live to watch North Field fill with bombers. His personal end came in disgrace and disappearance. A senior naval figure reduced to flight, paddling toward Aguajan, and then hiding in a dugout on Tinian's east coast. That ending suited the island's brutal logic. The admiral who had sat over an air fleet on a supposedly strategic island was not finally defeated by a single shell or a grand cavalry stroke. He was drowned by a process. Plans misplaced the decisive shore. Air power lost its forward fields. Authority lost its ability to impose order. The island passed from command to survey, from survey to grading, from grading to runway, from runway to sortie. By the time American bombers were warming up on North Field, Kakuta's kind of command had already been rendered irrelevant by machines he never truly stopped. Halloran could stand in the middle of his giant work and see a map turn tangible. Roads cut through the island in a grid. Broadway ran north and south. Camps spread. Service buildings went up. Fuel farms fed a bomber force. Coral pits yawned where material had been taken. White stakes disappeared as finished grade replaced them. Each vanished stake meant one more patch of uncertainty had been turned into surface. Larson, farther down in the hierarchy and closer to the ground, knew the achievement through smaller sensations. The vibration in the steering wheel of a grader. Coral dust gritting against his teeth under a cloth mask. The jolt of climbing down to pry out a stubborn stone. The sting of sweat in his eyes. The long look at a B-29 lifting heavily into the dark, barely clearing the end of the strip. Every man on the ground silently measuring whether it had enough height, enough speed, enough runway behind it. He knew the base as labor before he ever knew it as legend. If the Japanese could not explain how the United States turned coral islands into air bases, part of the answer lay in that difference of scale between explanation and experience. On paper, one can list runways, battalions, yards of fill, barrels of fuel, sorties flown. On the ground, the thing was more intimate and more relentless. It was a marine tank firing armor-piercing rounds into a coral hill so charges could be packed into the cracks. It was a Seabee welding new sides onto a truck bed because the old height did not carry enough. It was men dragging crates apart to make floors in tents before Quonset huts arrived. It was a grader operator leaping into a slit trench while rounds slapped the machine he had been driving. It was an airfield still under construction receiving bombers because the war would not wait. It was a white stake set in coral at sunset and gone by dawn because the line had moved and the ground had been transformed. By the summer of 1945, Tinian had become a city of aviation. Hundreds of bombers could be launched in a little over an hour. Crews moved through self-contained camps. Bomb dumps and maintenance areas sprawled. The island that had once produced Kane now produced missions. Some of those missions would become the most famous in the history of air warfare. But even before those final August flights, the daily fact of Tinian had already answered the strategic question. Whoever could build here at this speed, at this scale, with this confidence in supply and repair, would not need the enemy to understand the method. only to suffer the consequences. There is a temptation to make the story mystical because coral seems so insubstantial from a distance. Bright water, low land, palms, cliffs, reef. Yet nothing about Tinian's transformation was magical. It was material all the way through. Material in the steel ripped from a sugar mill and made into ramps. Material in the coral cut from pits and spread in layers. Material in the asphalt, the fuel, the quarter-inch plates welded to truck beds, the cables between wheels, the pipes inland from submerged lines, the bunks, the lights, the ration tins, the mail sacks, the spare parts, the socks sprayed against fungus, the bulldozer tracks clawing over white stone. That material world is what the title finally points toward. Coral did not become an airbase because anybody wished hard enough. It became an airbase because American doctrine arrived with tools and the conviction that tools, used without pause, could redesign a battlefield faster than an enemy could emotionally adjust to what was happening. Years later, the runways would gray and crack and sink under weeds at the edges. Jungle would creep back. Steel would rust. The greatest airfield in the world would become a silence interrupted by wind and birds. But imagine one white-painted grade stake left behind in the coral for a little while after the men moved on. The red cloth on it has gone stiff with salt. Its lower end is chipped, where a hammer drove it into the ground. Around it, what had been cane is now a runway broad enough for bombers. The sea still breaks against the same reef. The same cliffs still lift from the same water. Nothing natural has changed its mind. Only the war has passed over the island and taught stone to bear the weight of a nation.